Hello, Carol. This segment again deals with an aspect of Seattle, with an aspect of Dr. Clement A. Finch, who I'll call Clem throughout, who was my mentor in Seattle. He's 15 years older than I was at the than I am, or that he was. He died 6 months ago, 4 days before his 95th birthday. He was a giant in hematology, and as is true of many giants, not all, but many, they are humble and usually give credit to other people, which rightfully is really theirs. And Clem was a master of humbleness, tolerance, integrity, and always shared any of his ideas as giving credit to his fellows. And I'm one of those beneficiaries. This segment is going to deal with the creation of a teaching manual, Clem's idea, and the first version of which was the red cell manual dealing with red blood cells. Now actually at the time, about 1959 or 60, there was one major text in hematology. It was a 600 to 700 page book, revised, I think it was in its 6th edition, by Maxwell Winthrop from the University of Utah. A wonderful man, but a 600 to 700 page book costing $25 to $30 a copy, even then, seemed out of line to what Clem's ideal was. He wanted to have a short 50 to 100 page manual, soft cover, not copyrighted, costing no more than $1, and to be frequently revised. In 1960, he produced a short version of a hematology manual, about 50 to 60 pages, but it was really not what he really wanted. Shortly after that, having been with him for about a year or so, Clem recognized that I was particularly interested in teaching, or rather in facilitating the learning of students. So he really did 3 things. He assigned the second-year teaching block in hematology to me. Secondly, there was the creation of a national group called the Cooperative Group for Teaching Hematology, which had its locus at Western Reserve with Thomas Hale Ham, who was well-known teacher at Harvard, but who is now at Case Western Reserve, and John Harris, who was professor of medicine, head of hematology, who had published quite a book on the red blood cell. And Clem, knowing of my interest in red cells, assigned me and said I should be part of this group. And so we met periodically at the South Shore Motel in Chicago, about a block and a half from the Museum of Science and Industry. There were about a group of 15, and we decided we needed some help from people who knew something about education. And so we enlisted 2 professors from the University of Chicago, the education department. One was Professor Ben Bloom, the other was Professor John Ginther. And we worked together and early on decided that our teaching approach would not be lectures, but case development problems. And so we wrote a series of problems and a manual sort of as to how to use these, and they actually became part of the board certification in hematology, a board which was just created several years later. In any case, so that along with the teaching of the second year block, the assignment to this group, he said, why don't you take over the first of the series of manuals, and we'll call it the Red Cell Manual. And so I worked on that, and basically it consisted of learning about the anatomy of the red cell, how it's structured, what it looked like, what it's made of, what its metabolism is, how it maintains itself, then how it's formed in the bone marrow, what happens during circulation, and then finally when the red cell becomes effete, how it's removed and what happens to the contents of the red cell and how these can be used for diagnosis. So having studied the morphology, the metabolism, and the physiology, it was easy then to translate that into the pathology when any of these processes go awry. And that turned out to be what the Red Cell Manual was about. And it took, I think the first one was about 60 or 65 pages. I've forgotten exactly. So, and it was produced in 1963. Now, at the end of 1963, we moved to Albuquerque.
What prompted that move?
That's another story which I will go into.
Okay.
In any case, we felt it needed revision, and and the first revision took place in 1964, and I flew back up to Seattle for a weekend, and Clem and I worked on it pretty steadily over 2 days and produced another version in 1964. And finally, the last one we worked on together was in 1966, and that was, we did that in Las Vegas, because Clem, this was about halfway between Seattle and Albuquerque, and Clem had been in Mexico before then, so we decided to meet in Las Vegas. And that was the third revision. Now, there are a couple of things of interest related to that. The first episode that I would relate is the fact that in 1964, Susumu Shibata, who was professor of hematology in Japan, had heard about the Red Cell Manual and wanted to meet me, discuss it, and then ask permission to translate it into Japanese. So he and his daughter Ryoko, who was 12 at the time, visited us in Albuquerque, and we had a wonderful time together. And from that point on, every year we have received the most beautiful Christmas or holiday cards that the Japanese can produce. We have one for every year since about 1964.
Wow.
I haven't kept all of them, but I have many of them. Since then, Ruiko, who was 12, became a dentist and is now retired. Her husband is a pathologist, became chief of pathology at a medical school in Japan and is retired. And I'm recording this in January 2011, and the last beautiful card we've received was about 2 weeks ago. And they are just beautiful. Each one contains a picture of Ruiko, her husband, her children. Previous ones contain her mother and her father, both of whom are now deceased. So the manual, in a sense, built a relationship between Ruiko's family and ours. Unfortunately, we never visited each other again since '64, but we exchange annual holiday greetings. The second episode is of some interest, is that in '64, when Yoshiki Shibata and I were working and finishing the work on the mechanism of adenine, I decided that I would like a critique on the draft that I had prepared. And the person I knew who knew most about the metabolism of the red cell was a man who I had met in Philadelphia. His name was Samuel Rappaport. He leaned toward the left, and in early '60s emigrated to Humboldt University in East Germany. And so I sent him a copy of the draft of our studies on the mechanism of adenine to get his suggestions. And he sent back a list of suggestions, all of which were extremely valuable and really improved the quality of the paper. But in addition, he said he had heard of our red cell manual and asked that I send him a copy. Now, this is 1963 or '64, and the letter had been opened, presumably by the State Department, and contained a note that I should be circumspect about sending a red cell manual to East Germany. Now, this was surprising to me because this was 10 or 12 years after the McCarthy era, that this kind of activity should still be taking place in the State Department. Well, I showed it to the people at the Puget Sound Blood Center where I did my work, and the people in Seattle. Both groups suggested I not send the red cell manual to East Germany. They said, Ernie, you are early in your career. You will probably want to do quite a bit of international travel, and somehow you may not get a visa when you request it, and you'll never find out why your visa request was denied. And I thought about that, and I said, well, you know, my family and I came from Germany to escape this sort of censorship and persecution. And I said I would not adhere to that. So I sent a red cell manual to Sam Rappaport, who appreciated it very much. I never had any difficulty after that, and I had no trouble with international travel. But I thought it was an interesting episode at the time. The third episode relates to the red cell manual, which was the third revision in Las Vegas. I had picked Las Vegas and particularly the Stardust Hotel, because on our move from from Seattle to Albuquerque, we spent a week in San Francisco first at the wedding of Pete and Melanie Mayer, and then I drove from San Francisco to Albuquerque, but stayed overnight at the Stardust Hotel in Las Vegas, where the roast beef dinner was $2.95, and the stay was $8.
Wow.
So I thought that was a pretty good thing to do. And so when Clem suggested somewhere halfway between Seattle and Albuquerque, I said, why not the Stardust Hotel? And we made arrangement to meet there for a weekend. Now Clem came from Mexico, where he had done some consulting work on iron deficiency, and I met him there. I had previously arranged for an $8 room and asked if they could put a desk into the room. So when I arrived, the bellman said, do you have everything you need? And I said, yes, I think so. She says, are you sure? Say anything at all I can do for you. And I said, no, I was all set. So he took me to the room and opened the door, and there was Clem stretched out on the bed. He had been feeling ill, had a fever actually, but the bellman didn't know that. He looked at me, gave me a knowing look as to what this was all about. And so I didn't pay much attention to that, and Clem said, I'm not feeling so well, but let's get to work. And this was about 5:30 in the evening, and we started working and kept working. But unlike the second edition, which we started at the beginning and went to the end, and toward the end we got a little tired and got a little, gave it short shrift, we decided this time we would start in the middle, work to the end, and then get to the beginning. So we started revising and editing and so forth. And about 2 o'clock, Clem says, I need a milkshake. Now, a milkshake was not that easy to obtain at the Stardust Hotel at that time. So I walked down the strip, probably a half a mile, maybe longer, finally found a diner, got a milkshake for Clem, walked back, and we worked through the night and worked through the morning. And then, lo and behold, by about 4 or 5 in the afternoon, I forgot exactly, it turned out we were back to where we started. We had planned to spend the weekend, but we both looked at our airline schedules and said that if we could get to the airport within an hour, we could each come home. So we packed up like mad and raced out of the room, checked out, and there was the bellman. Gave me another look implying that Clem and I had had a falling out. And so, but we made it. Each of us got home in time, and so that was a lesson in sociology, if you will. And but the Red Cell Manual then became standard in a number of medical schools, followed by a manual of white cells, which I didn't edit as such, but which we wrote our own edition in Albuquerque, and one on coagulation and the platelets, and that formed actually the basis of our teaching of hematology in Albuquerque.
Yeah. So you pulled an all-nighter to do the third edition.
What?
You pulled an all-nighter to do the third edition. I've never known you to do an all-nighter in your life, my life. somebody else took it over after that for 4th, 5th, etc. editions?
It went, then Dr. Hillman took it over in about, in the 80s. The edition with Clem and I, and there was an additional author added, Hillel Giblet, in in blood groups that we did not deal with, the ABO, RH, and all the other blood group. And she was an expert from Seattle. She died about 2 years ago, a wonderful woman.
I had a couple other questions. One of them was, we seem to hear that you mentioned hematologists from Japan a lot. Is that because of the atom bomb that hematology got really big in Japan, or is it just, do you have any idea why so many
No, but that's
people?
a very interesting thought. It could have been. It turned out that there was a collaboration. There was the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, which one of my colleagues at the University of New Mexico was part of. And he had relationships in Japan. I did not. I don't, it's conceivable now that you raise the question that maybe Bob Anderson maybe had mentioned, who was aware of the Red Cell Manual, might well have mentioned that to Dr. Shibata, whom he met. And that may be why he visited us. That's a very good thought. I don't know. The recruitment of Yoshiki Sugita to help me work out the mechanism. He had been a fellow in Charlottesville over Dr. Shinuten, and I had heard of their studies and told Dr. Shinuten that I was very interested in working out the mechanism of how adenine worked. And he recommended that Dr. Sugita knew some of the techniques of separating the various compounds. And so by labeling these radioactively and analyzing the specific activity of adenine, labeled adenine and various compounds, we could work out how adenine in fact achieved its goal.
I remember Dr. Stone, I don't remember his first name. Lael was my friend. He was Bob Stone. He was in Albuquerque, yes. But he also, it turns out, had been in Japan right after the war, right? You knew about that.
Yes, and he was part of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission as well. In fact, that's how he met Bob Anderson and how he recruited Bob Anderson. Bob Stone was chairman of pathology, then became dean, and then Bob Anderson became chairman of pathology.
So it's all related. Yeah. When I was at the Chemical Heritage Society in Philadelphia, I think I told you this story a couple years ago when I went there, that we happened to be visiting the day that they had a conference there, and while we were looking at the things in the museum, the folks from the conference came down on break, and we were staring at this glass tubed thing, and a guy came over and he said, "Do you know what this does?" And we said no, and he said he worked with something in the early 50s that was another copy of this machine, but it had been developed in Japan or for Japan after World War II because it was a mechanical way of starting to count red blood cells for leukemia. That before that it had been looking at slides, but there was such a large number, there were so many patients that they needed to figure out a way to do it. It couldn't be done manually, and that this machine had been developed for that purpose.
I
So
didn't
that
know
ties
that. That's
in.
terrific.
Yeah, so it's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
we used Coulter. It was called a Coulter counter that we used for the automated counting of red cells, ultimately white cells and platelets as well, and those are still in use.
Was yours also basically a clear glass thing? Because I was really struck by the fact that today machines are basically black boxes. You know, so you have a machine, you really have no idea what the innards are doing. And as he talked about it, he could, because it was all clear blown glass and inside and things like that, you could see the whole process. He could point what was happening because you could really see everything. And I was very struck by the difference between that and our, computer
No, our
technology
machines
today.
were black boxes.
Black boxes.
Yeah.
They had those there too, so it was pretty cool. Okay, and then are you going to do later why Albuquerque, or do you want to include that in this segment?
Um, let's do a segment on why we left Albuquerque, why we left Seattle for Albuquerque.
Okay.
Hello, Carol. You asked the question as to why did we move from Seattle to Albuquerque, and I will try to give you the background of that, and you'll see again that Dr. Clement Finch, my mentor, whom I will call Clem, has really been a pivotal figure in my entire career, and was also the pivotal driving force that led us from Seattle to Albuquerque. So how did this all come about? We moved to Seattle 3 weeks after you were born. And we first moved for about 6 weeks into Union Bay Village, which was near Lake Washington, a series of temporary Quonset huts left over from World War II. And that was in July '59. About 6 weeks after that, we rented a house on, I think it was, I've forgotten exactly, it was off Madison. I think 2014 was the number, but I don't remember the street. Uh, I, and we lived there for about 2 years. Then we found a beautiful home that Eve really liked. It was in overlooking Sandpoint Way, overlooking Windermere and Lake Washington, and a beautiful view of Mount Rainier. We moved there in 1961. It was a beautiful H-shaped house, in a sense, where you had 2 wings, a central corridor, and then a kitchen and a living room as the other parts of the H. Carol ran around this house but didn't know how to bank her turns, so she bumped into the walls as she
ricocheting around.
ricocheted around. It was also the first home that Lori was in when she was born in December of '61.
And what was the address of that home?
5008 Pullman Avenue. And we loved that home. And I liked what I was doing at the University of Washington, doing well. The research, as I mentioned, regarding adenine and some other aspects were going well. The teaching was going well. And so one Saturday morning, it was in November of 1962, I gave a lecture at the Ross conference. Ross, I think, made pediatric foods. Anyway, it dealt with the use of isotopes in medicine, and my topic was the use of isotopes in hematology as related to pediatrics. At the end of the lecture, Clem, who was in the audience, called me to his office and said, "Ernie, that was a very fine lecture, but by the way, I'm not going to renew your appointment on the faculty." Uh, I had been a fellow for the first 2 years, from 1959 to 61, an instructor from 1961 to 1962, been promoted to assistant professor then in the summer of 62, but Clem said after the next year, "I'll not renew your appointment." Needless to say, I was pretty surprised.
Yeah.
And he said, "Ernie, you know, Seattle is going to be Finch hematology, and you're 34, almost 34. You'll never be more marketable, and you'll need to go somewhere you can establish a program that would be identified as Simon hematology." It was a beautiful and wonderful example of tough love.
Oh my, yes.
The kindest thing that Clem could have done. He elaborated a bit. He said, "I've been here 15 years and I've had numerous fellows. I've never had a second in command, and I don't intend to have one." And so that was it. I came home, told Eve that our stay in our beautiful home was limited. She was, I didn't learn that until many years later. She said she loved the home, but it simply wasn't suitable for young children. And so she apparently was not crushed that we would be leaving this home. Clem, after this, within a few days, maybe the next day, he actually left for a 6 or 8 week trip around the world. He was a consultant in iron deficiency and its prevention throughout the world. And so, for some mysterious reason, job offers seemed to arrive at my door. Now, I'd never received a job offer before, so I wondered how this conceivably could have happened. I think we all know why it happened. Of the attractive ones, the first that really caught my interest was one in Gainesville, Florida. They asked me to visit. After my visit, they offered me an associate professorship with tenure, 700 square feet of lab space, and a very nice office. I contemplated about it, and when I presented this to Clem, and he looked at it, frowned, didn't say much, finally said, "Why don't you ask for 1,500 square feet of lab space?" Well, the chairman of the department had 900 feet. So there was something mysterious about that suggestion, but that's what he said. Anyway, I wrote back another letter or so, but finally declined the offer. Shortly thereafter, I became aware that there was a new medical school in New Mexico, and I told Clem that I might be interested in that. So an interview was arranged for me with Solomon Papper, who was the chairman. At the time, there were 5 chairmen already appointed in Albuquerque. but only chairman of departments. There was a chairman of psychiatry, a chairman of medicine, chairman of surgery, a chairman of anatomy, and a chairman of biochemistry. So I went down there. I was asked to give a grand rounds. They presented a case, and I discussed the case. And then I came back, and shortly thereafter, I received an offer of a job, which was as an assistant professor with 296 square feet of lab space next to the elevator in the old Bernalillo County hospital. Clem looked at that. He says, "Sounds great." He says, "Wonderful." And so I accepted that. And what he was, of course, telling me was that, first of all, he knew that in Gainesville, in the department, there were 2 other associate professors. He knew that Albuquerque, this would be the 6th faculty appointment, that if I did well, there was no limit to what I could achieve there. It would be my own program, as it turned out to be, and I was made chairman of the curriculum committee, having had the experience in the cooperative teaching program.
Sure.
So Solomon Papper appointed me to that. In addition, he said something a year and a half later. He said that Clem had written a 4-page letter about me. He said he didn't paint a picture of an angel, but what I learned, 2 things. One, that if I came, there'd be no surprises, and there were none. And he said anybody who takes the time to write 4 pages on a candidate must think highly of that candidate. So Clem, again, directed my career. So again, you see the enormous influence that Clem had on the direction of my career. And it went on. Once I had the program going, initially, let me put it this way, I introduced the first 2 weeks of the medical school curriculum was a unit on the red blood cell.
Wow.
And it dealt with the red cell from a molecular level as to what the hemoglobin was made of and what one amino acid difference could make and produce sickle cell, to the global impact of the red cell because of anomalies in the hemoglobin. Sickle cell, for example, protected children from cerebral malaria, and several red blood cell diseases, thalassemia in the Mediterranean littoral, protected children from malaria. So there were several mutations, including the blood group Duffy, thalassemias, sickle cell, that persisted in the population because the heterozygote had a survival advantage in a malarial environment. And so one could trace from the molecular basis to the geography in this red cell unit. And we had an experiment on red cell metabolism to introduce the students to the gamut of medicine from molecular to geography, and that was the first unit. But Clem had an influence throughout my career. He was my first visiting professor of hematology once the division had been established in 1964, I believe. He then, when I moved into, we continued our relationship in hematology. I worked with Seattle on the education program of the annual meeting of the American Society of Hematology. Bob Hillman, who I mentioned before, and I ran those meetings for a couple of years, once in San Francisco and once in Puerto Rico. Clem was, once I went to the NIH and was head of the blood division there, he was the chairman of the advisory committee in blood. When I left Bethesda and came to Phoenix was the time Clem retired, so at least twice a year I would visit him. Now he lived in Cle Elum, Washington, out of the way toward Yakima, in a sort of rustic environment. He and his lovely wife, Genia, and I visited there about twice a year. And after a while, when he got into his late 80s, he moved to La Jolla, and I visited him there. And he and I became very close. We shared, he had some thoughts on alternative medicine, wrote a draft on it. I critiqued it, and we both learned a great deal from that effort. And when he got into his late 80s and early 90s, he thought our relationship was one of his supports, which I was very grateful for that thought. We visited him last about 6 months before he died. He died, as I mentioned, 6 days or 5 days before his 95th birthday on July 4th. And I must say that he had a pivotal role, really, in directing my professional career from 1995 to my retirement, really. I'm sorry, from 1959 to my retirement in 1995. There's one more thing I'd like to say about Clem, which is somewhat unique. Many chiefs or mentors of departments add their names to any publication that emanates from their division. That is the usual practice. I asked Clem to be an author, a co-author, on the first adenine paper, and he told me he never does that. He said he would not do that unless he had part of the research. I convinced him that the research really took place because of his seminal studies really trying to extend the storage of blood. And it was his idea in general and the techniques that were developed that led me to develop the adenine. So I said, please be part of this paper. And he said, Ernie, I will do this once, but never again. So he had several hundred publications with his name, but none of my publication or none of any of the other fellows' publications had Clem's name, which shows the humbleness and the generosity and the greatness of this man, who I would say would be one of 2 or 3 greatest hematologists of the 20th century, where some of us might have put a twig or even a limb on a tree. He would be the one who made the major trunks.
And is he recognized as such within the hematological?
Yes, he had a wonderful obituary in the New York Times last uh, July 1910. It focused on his role of iron deficiency and its prevention worldwide, but his developments or his contributions are far greater than that. They put the classification and the approach in hematology on a functional basis, physiologic basis, how things worked, as opposed to a morphologic basis, which had been the previous approach. And that functional or physiologic basis has proven to be uh, a much more valuable approach as to how to approach, diagnose, and ultimately manage hematologic disorders. So much for why we ended up in Albuquerque.